Welcome, folks. We appreciate you all coming back for another one of our monthly webinars. We have a great guest on this evening, and we'll talk about him in just a moment. But before we do, just some updates. The latest data from the month of February just got posted today in your SPC database, and so you might take a little time. Also added a column, I think it's G, but forgive me, you'll find it, it's towards the beginning, that is cost of gain. And so now that we have a number of months under our belt, we went ahead and added that column. So take a look at that. Also, you'll see that in general, we had one calf who's been struggling a little bit for a while, but beyond that, our gains are still quite impressive. We're averaging over 5 pounds a day for the last month. If you recall, the month previous, we had some pretty vicious weather and our gains dipped a little bit, but that's kicked way back up. And so your calves are doing really, really good. Probably the biggest challenge we have is when you see some of the weights on those calves, is we're going to start marketing just a little bit earlier probably than we initially intended. But again, I warned you of that last meeting, so that shouldn't come as a huge surprise to you. Also, your calves will be ultrasounded this Friday. And so that data will be going in here over the next week or so, and you'll get a chance to take a look at that. So watch for that getting posted up into the database. So I want to get right to it this evening. You all came here to listen to folks other than staff. Those staff will be on here with you, and they'll certainly help with questions later. But tonight we have a privilege. We're going to really talk about a day in the life of a feed yard, of an animal at a feed yard, and what they're going through. And so we brought on someone who has a fair amount of experience in that background. Mr. Trevor Tuell is going to be talking to you here for a few moments. Trevor has an interesting road. And so at present, he's working in the allied industry that works with feed yards and a whole host of other folks as well. And I'll let him describe that relationship a little bit later. But what makes him uniquely qualified to give a perspective on what a day-to-day looks like in a feed yard is not only does he come from a family operation that has been personally vested in a substantial feed yard, but uniquely, he's personally tied to the feed yard where some of you all had SPC calves last year. And so his commitment to this program is not just for a one-night effort. He and a number of folks that he is allied with have been staunch supporters of yours since the very beginning. So you're going to sit and get a chance to ponder what really goes on in that large-scale commercial yard while your calves are really in a more micro yard that is trying to reflect that situation, but certainly on a different scale. So with that, I say thank you for everybody being in attendance tonight. I hope you enjoy what you're about to hear for the next little bit. Mr. Tuell, I will turn it over to you. Trevor, the game is yours.
All right. Thank you, Chip. I appreciate it, and glad everybody was able to get on. I know we had some they said weren't able to because of the blizzards going on. So those of you that listen later or something to this recording, definitely feel free to contact me with any questions. When Chip and I first, when Chip approached me to give this talk, it was, originally our thoughts was to look at it as he said, a day in the life of a commercial feed yard. I'm going to do that somewhat. I'm going to talk about some decisions and management things that are done prior to cattle being delivered to a feed yard, and then decisions that are made not only from maybe an ownership but the feedlot side of things, the feedlot management and workers, all the way to the point of harvest. So we're going to look at it a little different than maybe the title. So we're going to look at it as commercial feed yard. As Chip mentioned, I'm one of the owners of the
Trevor, can I just hop in and let you know there's a fair amount of rustling or static or something?
I don't know where that's coming from. It's dead quiet where I'm at.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try and mute a few of us and see if that makes.
Okay, you went away. I'm not hearing that. I'm going to keep talking here.
Yep, we can hear you much better.
Okay, yeah, I don't know where that was coming from, but it was definitely distracting. So anyway, thank you. As I started to say, we're going to look at this as a commercial feed yard, and as I said, I'm one of the owners at the Chapel Feed Yard where this program started. The contest started a year ago. So just to give everyone an idea, a lot of you come from ranching backgrounds, and we're going to look at it as if you were possibly going to retain your own calves. The family was going to retain them and maybe finish those cattle out. So I look at a commercial feed yard as a hotel. They are providing space, pen space, for customers to bring their cattle in to feed and finish those cattle. So we have those custom feeding clients, and those clients can either be retained ownership as a ranch that retains their calves and going to finish them out, or that can be, clients of a custom feed yard can be investors. Maybe someone grew up on a ranch, is working someplace else, and would like to have a tie back into ag, into cattle feeding. We have quite a few clients who, maybe they're bankers, maybe they're lawyers, maybe it's the local grain dealer, maybe it's the John Deere dealer that feed cattle. We also have seed stock operators, people who are in the seed stock business, and they will buy their calves, customers' calves, and feed them. And we also work with some branded programs that people are purchasing cattle that are going to be finished out for specific branded programs. So as a hotel, the commercial feed yard, they have their charges that they are going to charge those clients. One of the main charges, and the first thing, and I don't know what your guys' sheets that you guys see or something, or some of you maybe have seen it last year, but we have what we call a yardage charge. And typically, depending on the yard, depending on what's included and everything, a yardage charge is going to be 25 cents to 55 cents per head per day. And that yardage is for the feed yard to cover electricity costs, fuel cost, and employee costs, salaries, insurance, and those things. Feed yards figure up what their costs are and then kind of divide those out on a per head per day basis, and those charges are going to be incurred to feed cattle. You also have feed. There's a markup on that feed. They may have their cost of the feed yard does, and then they may mark it up at 10%, 15%, 20%, something, and that's to cover cost of like grinding hay for their mill, for their grain bins, for their feed trucks and stuff. There's those markups on feed. And then there's also, as that hotel providing services, there's vaccines and medicines, and there will be markups on those. And then typically there's a chute charge. For every animal that goes through a chute, there will be typically $1 charge is what I've seen in most commercial feed yards across the country. Now, not all commercial feed yards have custom feeding clients. A lot of them will also feed cattle themselves. So they'll be company-owned cattle, or the ownership will feed cattle. But when they're figuring their cost and their break-evens of finishing those cattle, they charge themselves back those same charges, just as if it was another client. So we're going to look at this and say, okay, we're going to put some cattle in a feed yard. One of the first things you need to decide is, how are we going to market those cattle? the most common way that cattle are sold, fat cattle. And these things, when we say what are our marketing goals, it's going to make, there's how we're going to market those cattle is going to determine how we're going to manage those cattle, or how the management at the feed yard, how they're going to manage them throughout the period. So most typically, the biggest percentage of cattle across the country are marketed on a live basis. So, today's last week's market on fat cattle was around $1.26 per pound, or $1.26 per hundredweight. But that marketing is based on a live weight. Another way the cattle are marketed, you see a lot of cattle typically in Nebraska, Iowa, some in Colorado, some in northern Kansas. Kind of higher quality cattle will be marketed on the rail, and that's still based on pounds, but it's going to be based on a carcass weight pound, pounds of carcass weight. So that price is determined as well when you're going to market those animals. As I said, they're carcass weight. Another way the guys in Chapel Feed Yard, and I believe that you guys will market the cattle for the contest, will be marketed on a grid. Still based on pounds. It's going to be carcass weight pounds, but there's going to be premiums and discounts that will be contributed to the base of whatever that grid is. So let's just say you had a 1,000-pound carcass, and the price is $1. If those cattle, if you were to say, okay, they graded prime, then you may get a premium of let's say $20 a hundred. So that price then jumps to $120 versus $1. But if they're a yield grade 4, there may be a $5 discount. So then that price would go down to like $115. So still based on pounds. A thing that we need to remember is that we're always selling on our pounds. It's just what is that price? How are we going to calculate that price to those pounds? Usually grids are based either on a quality or yield grade. You have parameters when you market those cattle that they need to meet. And most typically, most grids have a base of a average choice yield grade 3. So based on that, there will be premiums and discounts. So if an animal is a choice yield grade 1 or 2, they would get a premium added to that price. But if they were a choice yield grade 4 or 5, then there would be a discount to that price. If they were a yield grade 3 and a prime, then there would be a premium. But if there was a yield grade 3 select, then we would have a discount. Other ways that cattle could be marketed, branded programs, and those will still typically kind of be tied to a grid base, but again, you're still selling pounds. There'll be premiums and discounts to that. Some of those premiums can be source and age. Some can be all natural. So those cattle had received no antibiotics. They can be NHTC cattle, non-hormone treated cattle, and there's a lot of other branded programs out there. You can go online and do some searches, but these are things that if you're getting to make the determination that you're going to feed cattle, you're going to finish them in the feed yard, you need to know what direction you're going, and this kind of with the end in mind. So you're going to make that determination. I don't know, we missed a deal here. Sorry about that, but you need to figure your break evens on what are those cattle going to cost, or what are your projections of what what those cattle are going to bring in the end, and what are the costs going to be. So, you know, we need to figure all cost, and we do projections. Most feed yards have break-even calendar or break-even calculators, or any of you, I did a quick search online. You can put in a cattle break-even calculator, and there's a number of them that'll pull up online, and you can kind of play with those and put different numbers in. You know, one of the first things will be your purchase price, you know, or you know, if you're a retained ownership, if your family, your ranch is said, you know, what price do we put on your cattle? You know, possibly look at your local sale barn and say, okay, a 600-pound steer is bringing this price. If we were to haul it to the sale barn, you know, then that's the price that you'd put in one of those calculators to determine the purchase price. A good way to go about it. You need to figure trucking, both delivery to the feed yard. So, you know, there's a cost to haul those cattle. If you were in North Dakota and you were going to ship those cattle to Kansas to feed, you know, there's a significant cost in trucking. And then there's also when you sell those fat cattle, if you sell them on a grid or possibly on the rail, you may have to pay the freight to the packing plant. If those cattle are sold live, and I have FOB there, that means freight on buyer. So the packing plant would then pay for the freight. So kind of need to know how you're going to market those cattle when you're figuring those break-even projections. You need to figure your estimated feed cost. The medicine, vaccine would be in there. You know, other cost. If you were going to grid those cattle, some grids require a fee to participate and send those cattle. It may be $2, $3, $4 per head. You know, you've heard of U.S. premium beef down in Kansas does an excellent job. High quality cattle. Sometimes there's a fee associated to be able to market those cattle that way to be part of their program. Brand papers, just little things, any and every cost that you can think of, and those calculators that are out there are pretty good to help you figure those things. Interest, you know, if you were going to borrow the money or you had money borrowed, you need to figure the interest over the time, not only on the cattle but also on the feed. And then you got to take into account some death loss. You know, that's a cost. What if, you know, I sent 100 animals all worth $1,000 and you know, 2 of them are going to die? You know, you just lost $2,000 right there. So, you know, typically break-even projections, the industry, you know, depending on the risk of those cattle on their health, we'll calculate from a 1 to 3% death loss, and those things will be figured in there. So once you figure all your cost, you know, lock those cattle up, you need to come up with a projected income. So you kind of figure what your average daily gains will be. And Chip said that those cattle were gaining over 5 pounds a day, which is just excellent, especially for the weight of those cattle. I'll commend you all for sending great genetics because they're doing quite well. So, you know, you may put a projection in of 1,400 pounds. You locked them up at 600 pounds. So they got to put on 800 pounds, you know, of weight. That helps you in figuring those costs to how much feed you're going to be or how much feed you're going to need. But, you know, back to the income, you're going to have, you know, your projected weight, and then you're going to, you know, what possibly is the price that's out there. And you kind of use the futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, or, you know, the packer will offer you some projections down the road when you want to market those cattle of what that break even or, you know, what that projected income would be. So we figure all of those things, and if feed yards or a feed yard manager can help in those, and he does a lot of that for his clients every day. And so we decide that we're going to feed those cattle. We're going to take them to the feed yard, and we need to figure out financing. You know, are we typically, most cattle feeders don't just straight write all cash for those cattle. They don't pay just 100% cash out of their pocket. That they will finance those cattle. You know, you can get that financing either through a bank, or most of the commercial feed yards across the country offer financing. So I have their 30% equity. You know, the bank would loan you 70% equity for locking those cattle up. So if you determine that those animals are worth $1,000 and you're going to lock them up, the bank would give you $700 to buy that 1,000-pound animal. Or if you were going to send them for your own ranch, some banks or feedlots can actually get you that 700 back, you know, to your operation or to you, you know, to have that money to operate on the year until those cattle are finished. So you have to put up 30% of that cash. Now it's 20% equity if you use some kind of protection. And what are those protections? You know, you're protecting the future price of those animals. And most of the time you're trying to protect those animals. So, you know, 5 months out, it looks like you're going to sell those cattle for $1.20 a pound. You want to put a protection in so that price doesn't go lower. You know, but still have that opportunity for higher prices. So you can do a forward contract with packers. The packer, you know, will offer you that price, set a price, and say, you know, we'll give you 122 5 months out from now, and your break evens are at 120. So you got a $2 per 100 profit right there. You may be willing to do that, and that's things that the commercial feed yard managers, and they have risk management guys that just continually set and work on that for their clients day in and day out. A basis contract. So, you know, a packer may say, hey, we will give you $2 over, you know, a futures price that's out those 5 months from when you're going to maybe ship those cattle. You know, if you're going to feed them 150 days or whatever it's going to be. And so they can say, listen, we'll give you $2 over a price at that point, and you can use the futures and you know, lock those cattle in based on a futures price. You know, that's where the hedging comes in, and this is probably another talk that you guys, I don't know if you've had any talks about the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and hedging and protecting cattle, but it may be one to do if you guys haven't done in the future. But there's hedging, there's futures that you can look at live cattle prices on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange that are traded every day of the week, and then there's also auctions. So we won't dig into that now, but those are just some of the things that in today's world, I would say that several years ago maybe wasn't done as much in cattle feeding industry, but there's so much volatility today, just with things happening around the world. There's so many other factors that are affecting futures that other people are not even in agriculture, but yet are getting involved, that there's a lot of risk. So, you know, hedging and locking those profits in has become a very big deal within the cattle feeding world. So we've determined we're going to send those cattle to feed yard, and now, you know, those cattle were ready for delivery. The feed yard manager's about ready to, you know, those cattle are on the truck, they're on their way. He's wanting to figure out, you know, the source of those cattle. You know, what is their stress level? Were those cattle weaned at the ranch? Have they been backgrounded? Are they lower risk cattle? He may not have as many health challenges because those cows have been weaned before they come to the feed yard. Are they unweaned? They're coming straight off of the cow. They're getting on the truck and they get unloaded. Those are higher risk cattle. And those can come, unweaned cows, as I said, can come from a ranch, straight from the ranch. They haven't, the risk, the health risk of those cattle is lower. But, sometimes unweaned cows come straight from, from the ranch to a sale barn. They may sit at the sale barn a couple days and then they get loaded and taken to a feed yard. That's what the industry considers high risk cattle. And that's going to be some challenges and some decisions that the feed yard's going to have to deal with when those cattle get to the feed yard. Or are those cattle backgrounded? Have they been turned out? Have they been fed, cake or with a feed truck or something? They know how to eat. Feed yards like those cattle. They're low risk. They know how to eat, and some of those health challenges they're not going to have to deal with. It's not going to take as much manpower and time at a feed yard. The other things, that feed yard manager, the health manager, vet, they're going to want to know some of the history on those cattle. Have they been on a mineral program? There's a lot of data and a lot of things out there. If cattle have been on mineral, the health challenges are much less. If those cattle haven't been on mineral, we're seeing some significant health challenges, higher death rates and stuff. What's the vaccine programs? Have those cattle had pre-weaning vaccinations? Have they been modified live vaccines? Have they been killed vaccines? I think you guys maybe had some of those protocols and vaccines and stuff before cattle were delivered. Those are important things in today's industry. And then are those cattle adapted to feed? Like I said, are they backgrounded? So once those cattle get to the feed yard, there's health protocols. And most commercial feed yards have a consulting veterinarian that they work with. And those vets make recommendations for the feed yard and how to handle those cattle. So those cattle are going to be processed. Most of the people that are dealing with those cattle are going to handle those cattle have all went through BQA certification. I know that's a big thing for the 4-H programs and stuff out there. So you probably have been through that. Those cattle get an identification. Typically, a lot of feed yards and stuff are using electronic EID, electronic ID. It's easier to manage those cattle when you have cattle that you're doctoring, and if you have multiple pulls on those cattle to doctor them stuff, it's easier to keep track of those animals just electronically. They probably get a visual lot tag. It'll have a number, so everyone in the pen may be lot 100, so they'll all get a visual tag, the same color with the same number. And some, depending on if those cattle are going into, if they're unbranded and are coming into a location or a region, an area in the country, going to be in a feed yard that has brand laws, some places will go ahead and brand those cattle. It's just easier for management and dealing with the local laws. Other thing that will be done is vaccination and when to administer that. And there's been some new data and some new research that's come out in the last couple years. We used to unload those cattle straight off the truck within 24 hours, tried to process those cattle, tried to give them, their vaccines immediately. We found that adds more stress to those cattle. And we're finding that if we hold off 4, 5, 6, 7 days, before we vaccinate those calves, we're seeing better results and better health on those cattle. So that's why it's just coming about. I've been to several seminars here in the last several months that it looks like a lot of people are going to hold off at that feed yard. It's just a stressful time and going to give that vaccine later. Most feed yards in the country, most veterinarians are pretty comfortable with using modified live vaccines. There hasn't been a lot of luck with killed vaccines. So just touched on that. Try to give cattle, not knowing their backgrounds or what they've been exposed to. They'll give them a wormer for internal bug worms and stuff, and also de-lice those cattle, especially wintertime. Antibiotic use, and we can discuss here for a little bit. It's this antibiotic discussion is becoming very big across the country. There's what we call the Veterinary Feed Directive, the VFD, and today it started last year, January 1 of 2017, to now feed CTC or AS 700, and some of you may know that on your ranches. You have to have a veterinary prescript, or also Tylen, which is used in the feed yards to lower the incidence of liver abscesses. But this antibiotic deal is becoming a big concern with our consumers. Now, we are following FDA rules, we're following USDA recommendations on using these products. They got to be followed to the script. But I read an article today that we had over, I believe, across the world last year, had over 43,000 people die from antibiotic resistance. So as people got sick, and we did not have there was not any antibiotics that could be given to those people because the bugs that were affecting their body, those drugs would not work on anymore. And so the CTC, AS700, and Tylen, there is a crossover from these animal drugs that are being used. They're also being used on the human side. And so there's getting to be a big concern, and as an industry, it's probably in our best interest if we can lower those antibiotics, just to give our consumer that we are trying to do something to help them. But I will tell you, I've seen in several feed yards over the last 6 months that we've lowered the antibiotics in those cattle on arrival, and we've actually seen better health, I believe, because we're not affecting those bugs within the animal. We're not causing some resistance within that animal, and we're not adding stress to the animal. So that's a thing that we can definitely have more discussions. Anybody wants to talk about that, you can contact me and we can discuss some more. Antibiotic use, if they're program cattle, if they're going to be sold into a branded program, or if they're going to be marketed possibly in HTC, you can't use hormones. If they're sold as all naturals, they're not allowed. As I said, giving the customer confidence, and then also that antibiotic resistance. And it's that resistance is, I'm involved with Diamond V, and we believe we have a product that we can replace some antibiotics with for cattle, and all natural product. But we've tested bacteria and stuff within cattle and within the environment that we're seeing those antibiotic resistance. Move along here, feeding protocols. Most of those feed yards have consulting nutritionists. those cattle show up at the feed yard. So the first thing we do is have a starter and receiving ration. That's going to be a high forage diet. These cattle are ruminants. They're the most efficient that we have, in the world to go out and eat grass and convert that into protein. So that receiving diet is high forage diet. Typically, cattle have free choice, long stem hay. You want to make sure that they have fresh and clean water. Those cattle could be on that. I'm hearing a few nutritionists out there. Some have always been okay. We give that to them the first day or two, and then they try to get them on ration. But I've heard of some feed yards here lately that are leaving cattle on that free choice long stem hay, high risk cattle that we talked about earlier, for even up to a couple weeks, and seeing better results on health on those cattle. So there's some things changing in the industry of maybe not pushing cattle as hard and keeping them on, the starting diet of long stem hay. And then we step up that ration and work our way toward the finishing ration. One of the most important people on a feed yard is a bunk reader. And they typically, you're feeding cattle 2 to 3 times a day in a commercial feed yard. They'll feed them in the morning or early, and then if it's 2 times a day, early afternoon. If it's 3 times a day, that there's very few doing that, but it will be like a morning, noon, and evening time. But that bunk reader is very important. You want to. They try to manage those bunks to where they're just about slick, but there's still some crumbs left. So, that bunk reader, you look at the storms that we're having across the country, he probably would have to increase the amount of feed because those cattle may be hungry. But if the wind's blowing in a blizzard, it's going to shove the cattle to the back of the pen. So it's a challenging time, and one of the real important people on a feed yard. Got corn there that can come in many different ways depending on what part of the country. They feed cracked corn, or it can be wheat or barley, but there's high moisture corn that corn's put up in pits at a higher moisture, or there's a lot of the larger feed yards across the country use steam plate corn, which is very nice feed. We got the different roughages you all can see there: corn silage, hay leach, alfalfa, straw, corn stalks. As we said, these animals are ruminants. These cattle are, and you still got to include that roughage within their diet. And then different sources of protein. Distiller's grain, we're seeing more and more of that coming out of ethanol plants. And a lot of the cattle feeding industry has moved from the Texas Panhandle and from the Southern Plains, moved more up. We're seeing more of that in the numbers have went up in Nebraska, seeing some more in Iowa, places where they have distiller's grain, cheaper feed to be able to utilize in feeding cattle. And then you also, minerals, vitamins, supplements that are added to the diet. Animal health, we talked about the bunk reader being one of the important people. The cowboys are too, and it is sun, rain, snow, doesn't matter what the weather is, that they are out there every day checking the health on those animals. Their job's to identify the sick ones. They'll pull those cattle to be treated. On an average commercial feed yard, within a pen, you see a 20 to 30% pull rate. It doesn't mean that they all get treated. They'll take them to the hospital to get observed, and they'll have a protocol set up of a temperature, and it may be everything over 102 temperature we're going to treat. If they pull them and they only have 100-degree temperature when they take that, they may go down here and just give that animal supportive care and take it back to the pen. But a feed yard likes to see a 20 to 30% pull rate. If they're pulling more than 30%, that they have a health issue in those cattle. If they're pulling less than 20, and as long as they're not having any death rate, that they're doing well. But Another thing that's happening in feed yards we're seeing is some new technologies being used to see what's going on inside of that animal. And they're ultrasounding lungs, or they're using a new deal that you can look up. It's called the Whisper, and it actually listens to the sound of the lung instead of actually looking at the lung. I believe Merck may be selling that now. But anyway, they'll set these parameters, SOPs, standard operating procedures, on these two things and determine whether to treat those animals or have supportive care. They may vaccinate them, revaccinate them. They may give them a probiotic and then send them back. We talked about the EIDs. One of the big things that they're checking on, we're seeing more across the country, is drug withdrawals. And so that's where the electronic ID works well, you know, to keep track of those animals that have been treated and make sure you meet those withdrawal dates. But they'll also put a visual tag in, typically a different color. They'll write a date on that tag, which will show the date that that animal's clear, that they could go to harvest. We have fallouts. You know, if those animals are sick, you happen to be feeding your cattle as a all natural. So if they got treated with an antibiotic, they're no longer an all natural. So they're going to go out of that program, but you can still feed them and finish them out. And so they'll typically get an implant at that time. And that's where the cowboys and knowing what the marketing plan is real important. Another thing the feed yards deal with, commercial feed yards, what we call railers. And a railer in a feed yard is an animal typically with 2 to 3 times they've been treated. That animal's not going to perform very well. You know, their feed conversion, their rate of gain, and there's, you know, a lot of data out there. Those animals aren't even going to grade very well if you were going to possibly market your cattle on a grid or in a program. So they have cattle, like I said, chronics. They get lungs are shot. You all have heard those that honk and make a lot of noise when they breathe. Or you may have some lameness issues. They may hurt themselves, may possibly break a leg or something. They'll sell those in the industry. They call those railers. Typically, let's say an animal's worth $1,000, you might get $250 for those, and they could go anywhere from being someplace that'll make dog food out of them to, you know, I know some places buy those and actually use that meat for zoos and different things. So we have some feeding period decisions. Try to move through here. We're getting a little long, but you know, revac. We talked about vaccinating those cattle upon arrival. If those cattle are healthy, they may wait 90 days before they revac them. They may want to revac them in 30 days if they haven't been healthy, just to give them a booster to help that health. You know, another decision that's made while feeding those cattle is, you know, if you're selling them live or on the rail, you may implant those cattle. Typically, those cattle will get an implant upon arrival, and then they will re-implant them 60 to 90 days later. Most implants will last 90 days. So if you're going to feed those cattle 180, about that halfway period, they will re-implant. You know, other things that a feed yard deals with day to day is the environment. So right now with this weather that we're hearing about across the country and these blizzards, they got snow to deal with. You're gonna have to remove that snow out of the feed alleys. You're gonna have to remove that snow out of the bunks. If it's piling up in the pens, you're gonna have to get in there and get it so those cattle can lay down. You got mud that we get into the spring and you know, the frost comes out of the ground, depends on how much moisture. You're continually cleaning pens and giving that animal the best environment in that pen that you can for them to lay down, to rest, to be able to walk from the bunk to water. And you know, a lot of them will probably put some bedding down, put some straw or corn stalks for them to lay down to get them up off of that cold ground, because that cold ground for them to maintain, to continue to grow. And as Chip said, you know, last month you guys had a lot of that cold weather. You know, those animals didn't gain as well because they were eating, a lot of that feed was just going for them to stay warm. So, you know, the best environment that you can put those animals in, the better. And then also through the summer, you know, heat takes a big effect on these animals, especially the heavier they get, the fatter they get, is a lot of stress. And we're seeing some products that people are adding to feed. We're seeing actually even some feed yards in the summertime are bedding cattle. Just to add some airflow, gets those cattle up off the ground a little bit, and seeing some airflow and seeing some good things from that. You know, and the market changes. You know, you may want to, you expected to sell those cattle. You never know when the market's going to change. You expected to sell them June 1, and the price is really good on May 10th or 1st of May, and your weights are really good and those cattle perform. You may pull them ahead, and so those are decisions that a manager's looking at. You know, how are those cattle performing? You look at their intakes, how much feed they're eating. You know, they have software programs that give them a expectation of how much they're weighing. So you may pull those cattle ahead, or, you know, if the market signals say, hey, in 3 weeks later, those cattle, you know, the price of cattle could be higher, you may decide to hold them. You know, consumption's still good. It looks like those cattle are still performing well. You may decide to do that. Other things, and it sounds like you guys, Chip said that's going to happen this week. You're going to ultrasound those cattle. You know, it may tell you that those cattle, some are getting too fat, or some are, you know, have reached the optimal point for marbling, and you may want to sell those cattle early, or you may want to go in and visually sort cattle, the ones that are getting really fat or ones that are getting big. A feed yard may go in and make those changes. Those are things that are happening every day as cattle get closer to their end point. So at that marketing time, we've went through all this time period. You know, it's time to market those cattle. How were those cattle sold? What was your plans? Did you have a forward contract on those cattle? If you did, the packers probably, you forward contracted them for the month of April to sell them. Typically, they take cattle either the first part of the month or the last part of the month, and that'll be discussed with the packer and the manager of finding that optimum time to deliver them. You may sell those cattle live, and some days when cattle are sold live, cattle are traded. Just depends on the supply and what's happening in packing plants. But you may sell those cattle on Tuesday and deliver them on Thursday, or you may sell them this week and the packer doesn't want to take them for 2 more weeks. You know, grid cattle on the rail, all those things, you know, are going to affect that delivery day and you know, selling these cattle. So cattle are delivered or weighed either in the morning or in the afternoon when they're shipped. If you're going to weigh, or if you're going to sell those cattle in the morning, commercial feed yard, if they may, if they're going to weigh them in the morning, you typically have a 4% shrink, and that shrinks for the water that they've drank, for the feed that they've consumed, and you know, to take care of that fill that's within those cattle. So they'll weigh them and then shrink them 4%. They may load them right then and put them on the truck, or you know, if the packer wants to ship them later that evening or afternoon, they may put them back on feed, but they're going to go with that weight that they took that morning. And then there's an afternoon weigh, and typically those cattle would have been fed that morning a little bit a percentage of their feed, and then they will shrink those 5%. It's time, to sell those cattle. We're going to close them out. You guys are going to be doing that, very soon. We talked about those hedges. It's time to get out of those positions. So if you had futures or you had options, you work with that broker or you work with the manager who's handling that. Typically, you want to get out of those prior to delivery. You could have done that sometime when things looked well before you knew you were going to deliver them on those prices, on those hedges, or you want to do it near delivery time. You don't want to sell those cattle in May and then be a long ways out. There's too much fluctuation. If you were going to do it in July or whenever you had those hedges on, are those cattle financed? So you're going to receive that payment's going to come for those cattle. We determined that we sold them. They went to the packer, and we got payment for those cattle. And we talked about, and I just mentioned here a few things. If you would have hedged those cattle with feed yard, so the feed yard, paid for the feed, they paid for the vaccines, they were carrying all of that cost. They weren't sending you a bill because you financed it with them. So after all of those bills are paid, they'll send you the remaining funds, and your hope is that you that you have more coming back than that 30% that you had to put up, for what you figured at the beginning. And it's the same thing if a bank does it. Typically, the bank will pay the feed yard bills. The feed yard sends that to you, sends you the bill, and your bank will be paying for those bills if you did the financing through them, and then you get those remaining funds. And I know this is a quick run through, and there's a lot of things we touched on, but hopefully in the end, you're profitable. So I know that was a lot to take. I know it took a lot of time, but hopefully that gives you an idea, and there's something there that may have piqued your interest, and you have some questions on, that I thought I had a slide, but I don't have it with my phone number and email, but Chip or anyone in the office can get that to you. But that is a quick run through of if you were going to feed cattle in a commercial feed yard and all the things that go into those decision makings.
Thank you, Trevor. I don't know if you can hear me, hopefully.
I can.
Okay, we've got a couple of us organizers that show up by the same name, so I can't ever tell which one I'm clicking. But that was a great talk. I think you did a wonderful job of kind of setting the stage of what it's like for those calves and for the folks running the yard. I guess one question I would have for you, especially given this audience of young beef enthusiasts, what advice do you have for people kind of in their stage of life, in their teens, maybe early 20s, some even younger than that? If you were kind of looking back and talking to yourself at that age, what advice would you give to this group of kids who are interested in the beef industry and kind of staying relevant in that area?
No, I actually growing up was involved in junior breed associations. Myself, my family. I think I'm probably the only. I was actually the president of the National Gilby Association 2 years in a row. I think I'm the only one that's done that. I think they bent the rules and talked me into staying for an extra year. But I commend you all for taking part in this program. To me, this program is a real world program. I grew up, I showed cattle, and as I said, we have a family feed yard, and own part of Chapel Feed Yard. So, this gives you an idea of what happens other than just a halter and what I always called the beauty contest. So I'll commend you all first for being involved in getting this knowledge. And you are all welcome to call myself and learn anything about this. I know you've had Billy Hall on talk before. I think he talked last year, partner of mine. But, you know, even within that junior breed association, that there's things and there's programs, there's youth beef conferences, probably, you know, your local, your FFA, you know, any program that you can get involved in for more knowledge, any university talks that they put on in your local area. You know, I would recommend, you know, going and listening to them. I went to one up in Nebraska the other day, and two of the local schools, they brought their FFA kids to the university talk. It was just a beef meeting, but, you know, reach out and do that. But those of you that are in college or about ready, thinking going to college, you know, I looked back and thought, oh, I would do animal science. Looking back, I wish I would have changed that. I did part of mine on business, but in today's world, I'll tell you, it's been a little over 20 years since I got out of college, and it has just changed so much from that time to today, of understanding more of the business and more of the economics. And I talked about the hedging side of things. You know, there's classes around, and I can even help get you in contact with people that do online classes for those if you want to learn more. It's such a big part of our industry to protect, you know, your equity, to protect your family operation, to not have those losses. There's ways out there to do that. So, you know, I just encourage you to keep gaining any knowledge that you can, any and every place. So.
Thank you. And I don't see any questions from any of the other attendees. So unless, oh, hang on, we've got a question coming in. What new technology do you see playing an important role in the future of feeding cattle?
I guess for me in feeding cattle, and that's the change that I've made in my life, and we just didn't have time to get to it today. You see Diamond Bee down here, and I encourage you all to go to diamondbee.com. We have a product, it's called NatureSafe. It's a product that is a fermentation product. We use yeast, but we add a whole lot of things to it. And we've been doing research that we have seen a change in paradigms to this industry of sick cattle, death losses, that we have turned that and actually have lowered the use of antibiotics. We've lowered death losses, and we're doing it with an all-natural product that we believe is affecting the innate immune system. I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of things. As I talked about the antibiotics and reduction of that, I think that's the direction we're going, and that's partially, you know, needed to make some changes for my family, my father to somewhat retire, and I made the move. And what was I going to do that I thought was going to make a difference to this industry? And I believe that we have a product, and there may be a combination of products out there, but I think some of these supplements that we can replace some antibiotics and feeds, I think is going to be a big change and a big direction going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess unless I see any other questions, I think we're gonna wrap this up, and just really want to say a heartfelt thank you to Trevor for not only coming and educating us tonight, but making yourself available for future questions, and in our arrangement with Chapel Feed Yard last year and also this year, just in advising us, has been really important, and we really thank a lot of the folks there. So thank you, Trevor. We really appreciate it. And if if folks have any follow-up questions, we can sure get you his contact information.
That sounds great.
All right. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay, thank you.